Over the years, you've heard me ask wealth manager Warren Ingram the big questions. How do we invest wisely? How do we protect our family's future? All those conversations, that entire library of financial expertise is now available as a podcast. Straightforward advice to help you build your wealth on demand. Just search for Warren Ingram's Personal Finance wherever you get your podcasts.
And now, The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa Corporate, an investment bank, proud sponsor of the African Blockchain Report 2024. Good evening, welcome to the program. I'm Stephen Grootes. Well, we'll just very quickly get to our lead story because our guest, Dr. Duncan Pieterse, the Director General of the National Treasury, is of course involved in the G20 Finance Ministers and Central Bank Governors meeting that is currently underway in KwaZulu-Natal. He's about to be dragged back into that meeting. A statement today from the Minister Enoch Godongwana that he seems confident there'll be some kind of communique from G20 finance ministers perhaps tomorrow. Duncan, good evening. I know you've only got a few moments with us. How close do you think we are to some kind of consensus on a communique in this meeting?
Good evening, Stephen, and thanks for having me. Well, we are quietly confident that we would be able to get there, and it's of course quite a significant achievement because a communique means that there's consensus amongst the members of the G20 on a range of different issues. And I think at a time like now, I think that kind of achievement is quite remarkable.
I won't go too much into the sticking points, but what have you agreed on? Clearly quite a few things.
Well, it would take me quite a bit of time to take you through everything, but just to give you a high-level overview, there are typically a number of different elements to a G20 communique. There's always some language on the global economy and how the ministers and governors see that evolving and what the issues are. We always spend some time talking about international financial architecture. Obviously, a big issue there is the multilateral development bank roadmap for the reform of MDBs and a number of issues related to debt, such as the common framework, which is how we deal with countries that are in debt distress. That's always a key feature. Then sustainable finance would typically feature as well, where we talk about the kinds of mechanisms to unlock sustainable financing options, the role of carbon markets, and so on. And then infrastructure and financial sector issues would typically round out a communique. So there's usually quite a lot of detail, and that's why negotiating one often takes a lot of time.
The U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent isn't there. Is the U.S. taking part meaningfully in these discussions? There was a comment earlier, I think it was attributed to the finance minister, that the U.S. was a little concerned with issues around sustainable financing or the wording of that.
So the U.S. Is definitely taking part meaningfully in our discussions. We started our virtual communique drafting last week already in Pretoria, Monday and Tuesday, where they were well represented. And here this week in the deputies, where myself as the finance deputy and Rashad Cassim as the central bank deputy, we chair the discussions. The U.S. finance deputy was present along with his team. So they've been very engaged. Of course, the Treasury Secretary is not here, but they are often, even in the case for our own finance minister, there are often domestic obligations that mean that finance ministers can't travel to these kinds of events. So we've been very happy with their participation, and the U.S. team has definitely been engaging very constructively.
And Duncan, we've got a minute left, but I must ask about a burning issue in our environment. The inflation target is a major issue for us. We keep hearing phrases like there'll be an announcement imminently, soon. Is there a time frame at all as to when or if, I presume it's when, that will happen?
Well, there is no time frame, Stephen, but what we have said, including when we engaged investors after the recent budget, is that we are concluding the technical work on our side. A key aspect of that is a full and comprehensive understanding of the fiscal implications of a lower target. And once that work is complete, that work will be passed on to the Minister of Finance for his consideration, and that's then when he will be in a position to decide how to take the matter forward.
It is the minister who makes the final decision, right? And he asks the Reserve Bank. I mean, there's consultation, sure, but it is the minister who makes the decision?
It is the minister's decision, but of course, in consultation with the governor of the Reserve Bank.
I'm sure they're coming to get you already. They'll want you back in the meeting. Duncan Pieterse, I really appreciate the time. Thank you very much indeed. Director General of the National Treasury, and of course, very much involved in those discussions. Well, someone else who's very involved in those discussions is the Deputy Governor at the South African Reserve Bank, Rashad Cassim, joining us now as well from those meetings. Deputy Governor, good evening. Clearly you were involved in the preparatory work, as we heard from Duncan Pieterse. It would seem for the moment, touch wood, that some of that work's been very important and may have laid the groundwork for what we hope will happen tomorrow. Deputy Governor, I don't know if you can hear us. All right, we seem to have lost Rashad Cassim, the Deputy Governor at the South African Reserve Bank there. I understood that he was available to talk to us at the moment. As I say, we are dragging people from meetings, literally. And so we are, from time to time, you'll find that their attention can be distracted. Right, I think he's back with us now. Deputy Governor, there you are. Sorry about this. Yep. You were clearly involved in the preparatory work that was going on last week and earlier this week. Are you optimistic that some of that is going to pay off in these meetings?
Stephen, the whole idea of the G20, and I heard Duncan speaking about it, is that there are many priorities we have. Some of them you can get more traction on relative to others. But, the G20 is a relay match. We took over some important issues from the previous presidency, which was Brazil. Brazil took on some very important issues from India. So, we're very confident that there's some momentum has been built. There's a bit of division of labor between some of the issues that the central banks focus on relative to the Ministry of Finance.
Well, I was going to ask you about that. I mean, obviously you have the same overall priorities, but as central banks, I presume you focus more on some of the technical aspects.
So one of the successes of the G20 is that it works particularly well when there's crisis management. It worked particularly well in the great financial crisis, and it worked very well in the COVID crisis. One of the products of the great financial crisis was the establishment of something called the Financial Stability Board sitting in Basel. This board was a response to the financial crisis, and that is why when we talk about global bank regulation, we talk about Basel III, all the kind of finer aspects of harmonization of bank regulation to prevent financial instability is one of the products of the G20, and we continue at this meeting to refine, look at the non-bank financial sector and so on.
Strengthening multilateralism, the ability of financial institutions to respond to a crisis. There's a lot of work that's been going on that. You've just alluded to some of that. I presume that's not really a story just of announcements. It's a story of sort of ongoing cooperation. And these meetings are kind of signposts along the road in that process?
So the G20 is an interesting construct. It's a consensus-based organization. It allows countries to put issues on the table. Some of them are simply putting issues on the radar that may not be on the global radar. Others may actually lead to policy changes and so on. So, one example is that everyone's talking about tariff uncertainty. The World Trade Organization is the premier institution where countries commit to most favored nation status. In other words, if you impose a tariff on one country, you impose a similar tariff on other countries. The G20 is kind of an opportunity to discuss why is it that there's a retreat of multilateralism? Why is trade breaking down? Why are countries concerned about trade imbalances and so on? So it's really that opportunity to sit and go through and get some consensus. Some of it would be expressed in a chair summary or a communique.
You talk about that. I mean, there's quite a bit of uncertainty around all of that, and a lot of it at the moment comes from the US. There was a suggestion yesterday that the US President Donald Trump might be preparing to try and fire his chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell. I'm not sure legally that he has the power to do that. But just that kind of threat must pose a risk in some ways to the entire financial system. To put it another way, it would make your life harder as a deputy governor of our Reserve Bank if something like that were to happen.
So what we will emphasize is that countries around the G20 table will emphasize over and over again the importance of central bank independence to carry out their price stability mandate. And I think that the peer pressure makes many domestic policymakers and politicians, rather, in their domestic constituencies think hard about the consequences of wanting, if that is the case, if Trump follows through with this, there are consequences. We all rely on the U.S. Treasury as a safe asset for our reserves, for our portfolios, and if for some reason there's some indication that a country is not being able to kind of manage its inflation well, that has consequences, of course, for the whole world in many ways.
It would seem, and this point has been made several times, but it appears to be becoming more and more difficult to be a central banker. There is suddenly, over the last 5 years, a lot more for you a lot more that keeps you up at night. And I would like to think the one place where some of those things are discussed, I presume very politely, is in meetings like this.
Yeah, so the whole point about the G20 is to be able to do what a country cannot do on its own. That the nature of the interconnected world, we use the technical term global spillovers. If the U.S. tightens monetary policy or the EU tightens monetary policy, there are consequences for us. If there's war and conflict in one region, there are consequences at the domestic level. So the only ways you can, no matter how good you are in your domestic policies, some of the external risks could undermine your domestic policy, and that is why we have forums like this to really get to the heart of getting cooperation on issues that have negative consequences for the global economy.
Deputy Governor, I'm afraid I must take advantage, and you might feel a little aggrieved, to ask you about the possibility of a lower and tighter inflation target. We know that the Reserve Bank appears to be, I don't know if to say in favor of it is the right phrase, but certainly there's been a lot of technical work being done. If it is 3%, if that is going to be the new inflation target, if it is announced relatively soon, would you be ready to implement that? Would you be ready to manage that?
I was fortunate enough to hear the DG on this. I think that the SARB at its last meeting emphasized that globally we're a bit of an outlier as far as emerging markets are concerned. There were good reasons why we have been historically at 4.5, but I think that the SARB has done some work that says it makes a lot of sense to be at a lower target, and the general view is that this is 3%. And I think that, as Duncan said, Treasury is still finalizing some of the technical work. It wants to look at the consequences of this on the fiscus, and that's where we are at. And let's await the discussion between us and Treasury more formally on it.
I'm sure you've heard the view of Kevin Lings. Other people might have made the same point, that the Reserve Bank, one of the reasons our Reserve Bank and your institution has such high credibility is it's managed to keep inflation within the target band 75% of the time. But it's much easier to keep inflation within a band of between 3 and 6% than at 3%. You don't have concerns about the credibility over the longer term, just because what you'll be trying to do will be that much harder.
So I think what is important about the 3% is it is true that when you have shocks, what are these shocks? You have a combination of food shocks, oil shocks. It is true that the likelihood of going above 3% is much greater than going above the top end of the existing target, which is 6%. It's flexible. What it means is that, if inflation goes up, breaches 3%, if you were in that kind of target, and you were aware of the fact that is a a transient supply shock. It's important to signal to the public that if you are above 3% because of all these shocks, that you're not going to get to 3% immediately, that it will take a while. But the important thing is that you're signaling that that's where you want to go. That's the level you want to get to, but it's not an inflexible target. And I think that's how one should treat the 3%.
Deputy Governor, I really appreciate you taking the time tonight. I know there are a million things for you to do right now. Thank you very much indeed. Deputy Governor at the South African Reserve Bank, Rashad Cassim.
The Money Show.
The markets.
Rudy van der Merwe is Portfolio Manager at AdviceWorks. Rudy, if I may, if we can just pick up on the inflation target conversation. Whenever someone in authority says it'll happen soon, imminently, whichever word they use, the rand strengthens. And despite everything that's happening politically, despite everything that's happening in our economy and the lack of growth, it seems almost quite realistic to assume that this is going to happen.
Good evening, Stephen. Yeah, it's looking more and more like the commentary is becoming more pervasive and I think and more persistent. So I think it is likely to happen. The rand strengthening around that is not necessarily easy to reason so much, but we might find ourselves in a situation where the interest rates are higher for longer and just to try and keep our or to bully inflation rates down. So it doesn't mean it's a painless process, but yeah, I think we are headed there one way or another.
Coronation was up very strongly today, up around 5%. What is kicking that? I mean, they had one or two recent reports that certainly they're being rewarded for something.
It seems like that's around assets under management, Stephen. So they actually had a report out today just stating that the level of their assets under management is now about 737 billion rand. And that is actually quite decent growth in asset under management. So year to date, they're up in the region of 11% or so. And year on year, probably about 17%. And this is the first time in a while that we've seen sort of this rate of growth of assets under management. They don't give a breakdown in that announcement, so one doesn't know how much of it came from asset prices strengthening, from markets doing well, and certainly a big chunk of it would have come from there, or whether it was from inflow. So that's hard to say. But yeah, for the last number of years, since about 2015-ish or so, assets under management were very, very sluggish and very often were growing negatively. I think around that time there was a lot of pressure on asset managers generally for charging quite high fees, and probably around about the same time, I think passive management started becoming a bigger part of the market. So one saw a lot of outflows related to that. The fact that they're now growing obviously means that their revenue obviously is going to be positively supported by those assets under management. So hopefully that trend continues.
Richmond yesterday, they had a quarterly sales update, and I mean, it looked pretty decent for most of the world, a little bit down in Asia. They were up 1% yesterday, down over 2%, down I think over 3% actually today. Were investors just sort of having another look where there's maybe a bit of disappointment somehow?
Yeah, generally it wasn't a bad update. The sales were up fairly decently, specifically in Europe and the US. But it did the Asian portion of their sales, which effectively is China, and that's the sort of largest portion. Probably about just over 30% or so of their sales come from Asia, and those were flat, which I suppose was an improvement on the previous period where they were actually down. But I think the market had possibly hoped for a little bit more growth coming from Asia, which is obviously becoming a dominant portion of their market going forward.
I mean, obviously, Asia will really matter to a luxury goods company like that. And in a way, it somehow, as so many things do, takes us back to a conversation around what's happening in China.
Yes, no, absolutely. And there's absolutely Chinese driven. China is a massive, massive market for Richmond. Obviously, as the Chinese populace sort of emerges into middle class, that has the potential to really have a very impact on the demand for luxury goods. A small percentage increase in their wealthy segment could lead to a massive increase in the sales for somebody like Richmond or LVMH or some of the other luxury producers. So they are very, very important in that space. And traditionally, there's been a lot of gifting of luxury goods has been one of the ways that people reward each other, and travelers from China often look for luxury goods as a store of value as well. So yes, it is very important in their lives, and it would be good to see that market growing more aggressively.
There was something going on in platinum that I didn't quite understand, and I wondered if maybe you had a better idea on it. The platinum price was up quite strongly. Northam and Implats were up, but Valterra was down quite significantly, about 3%. For no reason that I could see. Was there maybe just a little bit of selling off from sort of from people who aren't following the share very closely?
It could very well have been that, Stephen. There wasn't any particular news out around the company, but it's only been listed under this name relatively recently. So effectively, Anglo unbundled a big chunk of their ownership of Amplats, which is now called Valterra. And very often when that happens, people get a very small piece of their portfolio represented by such unbundling. So Valterra might make up to 0.2 or 0.3% of a portfolio. And you find a lot of those shareholders very often then are sellers of that, because whether it doubles or halves, it's too small in their portfolio to actually move the dial. And you might well find that is what's happening. It is generally the case with unbundlings that people often there's very often under-researched companies, and they're small holdings, so people do tend to sell them off. And they slowly sort of move to stronger hands, and over time one can see potentially recovery in those sort of companies. Very often the management, once they're unshackled from their previous sort of corporate noise, are often better performing companies. In fact, there are investment funds that specifically invest only in unbundled companies to try and benefit from it.
Rudy van der Merwe, thanks so much. Portfolio manager at AdviceWorks, bringing the time on the Money Show to 6:30.
Travel isn't just about destinations. It's about the people you meet, the cultures you immerse yourself in, the stories you carry home. I'm Relebogile Mabocha, and on my travel feature, I take you on a journey beyond the guidebook. Each week, I connect with fellow travelers, insiders, and storytellers to bring you the heart of every place. Whether it's a hidden gem right here in South Africa or a dream destination abroad. Join me as we travel through conversations, memories, and inspiration. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes, live on 92.7 and 106 FM, streaming on the Prime Media Plus app
and DSTV channel 856.
You'll know the name John Manieke, someone who we speak to from time to time. He's head of financial education at Old Mutual. And he said today that gambling is a long-term threat to the South African economy, a threat to the South African economy in the longer run. And I think he's talking, I don't want to speak for him, but primarily about, and this is one of the big aspects of it, the literal explosion in online gambling that we've seen. It's not just that there's a high rate of gambling. I think what is so extraordinary about it is how quickly this has happened. Currently, it would seem gambling, the money that flows through gambling is 1% of GDP, which is astonishing when you consider how quickly this has happened. And then, and this would just be my view now, I'm not convinced that much of that money is coming back into South Africa. Yes, of course, people are employed in all sorts of different ways, and directly as a result of this, and indirectly too. But if Amabungani, an investigative journalism unit that I have a very high regard for, to be believed, and I have every reason to believe that they should be, well, it would seem that actually a lot of the money just flows somewhere else. It's not owned by South Africans in the end, not owned by people who are living here and, paying bills here and employing people here. My point, though, is you will have heard, sometimes from me, sometimes from other people being very critical of online gambling. Would like to hear you make the case for it, please, if you choose. 011 8830 702 021 446 0567. I won't interrupt you. It'd be important, I think, to hear the case for it.
702. Stephen is on X.
At Stephen Grootes.
Well, various reports today, the Public Investment Corporation lending the chicken producer Daybreak Farms, which it owns, another 150 million rand. The firm can't pay its June salaries. The PIC already giving 250 million rand. You may recall the entire operation seemed to be about to close several months ago. It emerged workers weren't paid, and in the end, hundreds of thousands of chickens had to be put down because they weren't being cared for. Sabelo Skiti is an investigative journalist at the Sunday Times. He's been reporting on daybreak farms for a number of years and really trying to alert, I think, the nation and the PIC to what was going on there. Sabelo, good evening. I suppose the PIC probably feels it has no other option, but isn't it just now throwing good money after bad? I mean, it's already thrown a lot of money that way.
Good evening, Stephen, and good evening to all your listeners. Certainly when I saw those headlines, it came to that point for me where I was feeling like, and I suppose, the conundrum that the PIC faces is that when you've got sort of like the political consideration, if you consider, we are sort of like almost like a year away from very, very key local government elections where we are seeing that ANC's backslide will continue. So the mood, I think, within even the ANC itself is one that, people don't think that, the elections will carry on the way that they've carried on in the past. But of course, and I do know this for a fact, that there's been tensions among the three funders of the PIC, if you like, the Compensation Fund, the GEPF, and the UIF, especially about this point where they keep asking the same question that why are we putting money into, what seems to be like a very deep and dark abyss, when the PIC goes to these funders for these sort of like, stopgap funding measures, they seldom put up a business case. So it's always about, let's save these jobs, we've really put money in there, let's try and make sure that these entities continue to survive. But the more prudent of those board members are always asking in those investment committee meetings, but you guys are not putting up numbers for us. Remember, this is money, we're supposed to get return on investment here. What are we getting in return for this, especially if you consider the sort of governance issues, that plague these entities?
There is, if I recall, the Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana has ordered a review of the PIC's unlisted investment sort of space. There were other stories about the unit last week. Do you think the PIC has learnt any lessons from all of this? I mean, there was this. There have been one or two other cases, but it's really if something is listed, and yes, IO Technologies was listed, but you can at least see what's going on. When it's unlisted, you can't, and that's really the daybreak story.
The fact that there's a science behind investing, right? And the safety and security that comes with listed assets is one that one can almost get an independent view of whether this is a prudent investment or not. And I suppose the danger with unlisted assets is that you might only see the problems once they manifest, as we'd seen with Daybreak, A lot of people weren't seeing the sort of damage and erosion of value that was happening there up until you get to a point now you're culling in excess of 300,000 chickens, and you're not able to pay salaries. So I think, and to your question, I don't necessarily think that the PIC gets the message for now. I'm really drawing that from the sort of interventions that they've made. One of the other news of this week, of course, is the suspension of Thabiso Moshikare, the acting head of the unlisted investments inside the PIC. This is a gentleman that had been returned to the board of Daybreak as part of Daybreak's intervention. The PIC's intervention into Daybreak, and yet if you look at the man's past, you will find that he was an integral part in the breakdown of governance there. So I don't think that these guys are necessarily beginning to see or get the picture, but I do think that the political pressure that the minister is beginning to bring to bear, of course, the things that do come out when you get these sort of investigations are such that, it will propel people to start behaving in a more sensible, manner.
And Daybreak itself, so it has assets, it has workers, I presume it has customers, I hope so. Is there any chance of it recovering, do you think?
Look, when you talk to the people that, number one, know the business, and secondly, know the sector, there are chances of Daybreak actually coming back and turning around. I mean, one only needs to look at the fact that when they were in, the worst of the trouble, there were still people that were still talking to them, trying to say, look, we'd like to buy this business from the PIC. So I think primarily because of other issues. If you think about the fact that chicken is, a protein that is probably the most accessible. And the fact that you've got all these other products except for the actual chicken itself that you can derive from the value chain. And the fact that it's unlike farming goats or farming cattle, chickens have a very high, I don't know if you can use the word high, sort of turnover or short lead time.
Sure, yeah.
Chickens, they get to the age to slaughter very quickly. So for those reasons, it's always a business that can easily turn around. And I think for people like us, it was also, the reason why it was staggering for us that, the PIC could fail so spectacularly run a business of that nature.
Sabelo Skitty, really appreciate the time and the work. Thank you. Investigative journalist at the Sunday Times.
Travel isn't just about destinations. It's about the people you meet, the cultures you immerse yourself in, the stories you carry home. I'm Hlelo Giyose, and on my travel feature, I take you on a journey beyond the guidebook. Each week, I connect with fellow travelers, insiders, and storytellers to bring you the heart of every place. Whether it's a hidden gem right here in South Africa or a dream destination abroad. Join me as we travel through conversations, memories, and inspiration. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Bank, proud sponsor of the African Blockchain Report 2024.
Well, of course, you'll hear from time to time, in fact, fairly regularly, calls for change, calls for more diversity on boards on the JSE, and the new South Africa Spencer Stuart Board Index showing that there is a slight increase in the percentage of board positions occupied by women. This is in the top 50 companies on the JSE. In 2023, 35% of those positions were held by women. Now it's 37% of board director positions. Also suggestions that women are staying in these positions for longer. Mpo Saboni is the board and CEO consultant at Spencer Stuart. Mpo, good evening. What trends are we seeing? I mean, it would appear that we are seeing a trend in a positive direction.
Good evening, Stephen, and thank you for having us on your show. Yes, the trend is positive, even if it is slow. It's better than it was 10 years ago. And 37% isn't fantastic. It's not the 50% that some boards or countries may be aiming towards. But if you compare South Africa with other countries, we're not doing too badly. If you look at South Africa versus the US, where it's 25%, Japan at 3%, Switzerland 35%, more or less like us. There are countries that are struggling with diversity of gender.
It's quite astonishing in a way because there are particular features of patriarchy in South Africa. Look at our gender-based violence rates. Look at the sort of life chances of men and women. Suggestions sometimes that there's they're different, there's certain parts of our society where maybe there's a kind of quite difficult sort of patriarchy. And yet, we're not doing as bad. I mean, we're doing better than the United States. I mean, that's very interesting.
Yes. So it does ultimately come down to what the collective prioritizes. In this case, the collective is the board. Maybe broader society may have challenges and come up with a litany of sins that you've outlined. But I think the collective called the board over the past, I'd say, 20 years in South Africa, and that's earlier than other countries like Norway and Switzerland, have prioritized. And they've done it for a number of reasons. One is, let's call it the moral imperative, to get to parity or representation. The other one is good business sense. A diverse board has a greater chance of making better decisions, simply because you've got, whether it's more women or more younger people or more engineers in a particular sector, whatever the measure of diversity is, if you've got sort of a spread that works for your company and the strategy that it has, it can be, companies have discovered that it can be a real advantage.
Are you seeing are you seeing the rate of change changing at all? Are you seeing the rate of change speeding up at all? Is there momentum?
No.
Or are we getting to a point where it's 37% and to get it to 40 is actually going to take us 10 years?
No, I wish I had a crystal ball, but I don't think it's 10 years. I think, to get to 40 is a couple more years. And remember, we're talking about the JSE top 50. Other organizations may have gotten there already, but they're just not on the JSE top 50.
You spoke about how intentional one has to be. I mean, companies have to make these decisions. We have political parties do similar things, that you actually have to make the decision and then do it. And without that, it doesn't happen. And I mean, there are various ways to kind of make companies do it. The JSE can say certain things. I think, though, that what's really happened is that South Africans just have, it's become common to almost demand it. If you see a company that only has men on its board, you kind of look at it strangely.
Yes. And companies and boards in particular quite often see the negative impact of not having a diverse board. And remember, in this case, I'm talking about whatever form of diversity is important to you, whether it's age, ethnicity, or gender. It's easy to alienate potential consumers and potential employees if they don't see some advances in diversity either on the board or on the top executive team.
Are we seeing any changes with regard to the age at which people are coming onto or leaving boards? Are people staying on for a little bit longer? Are they leaving a little bit earlier? Are they coming on a bit younger?
Yes. Women are coming on earlier. Men are leaving later. At the basic level. What that does is, if you've got the right skills, because right now we're talking about gender, but if you say those people, men or women, have the right skills, they're now coming at this either with different ages. What it does is widen the board's purview of perspectives at the younger end and at the older end. They will benefit from the advantage of those who've seen multiple business cycles over the years, plus benefit from the fresh perspectives of people who see the business challenges maybe from a different lens.
Thank you very much indeed. Paul Saboni is board and CEO consultant at Spencer Stewart. You're with The Money Show at 7 o'clock.
And now, The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Bank, proud sponsor of the African Blockchain Report 2024. Lots to come in the next little while. Investment School this evening. Don't forget, I've had to practice this word just a little bit, but it's a particular kind of word that is going to be applied to the US President Donald Trump. It's called the Lollapalooza effect. If you want to know what the Lollapalooza effect is, you've got two choices. You can Google it now, or you can wait until 7:30. We'll get a full explanation as to how it actually relates to Trump and his negotiating style. It's a very, very interesting kind of story. We'll be looking at small business in a little while as well. And part of that is about the G20. Part of it is about what's happening around the G20. Bulelani Balabala will be with you. And of course, this evening also, don't forget, looking at matters tech, we look at data centers in just a moment with Jan Vermeulen.
The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes, live on 92.7 and 106 FM. Streaming on the Prime Media Plus app.
and DSTV channel 856.
Just a little observation around trade unions with very different constituencies. So for a long period of time, NUMSA, the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, they're the main union in SAF2. They broke away, or actually, I watched it happen. I was quite closely watching it happen at the time. They were kicked out of COSATU. And they've been seen as, I suppose if you had to rate our unions from kind of radical to not radical, NUMSA would probably be seen as radical, right? I think we'd probably accept that. I don't think they would have a problem with me saying that. I think they're very proudly a sort of radical union. They get as much as they can for workers. It's their job. It's what they should do. And then you have Trade Union Solidarity, an old kind of a union that came out really with a sort of a large membership of people who speak Afrikaans. Or certainly that's how it was formed a very long time ago. And certainly I wouldn't say seen really as a kind of radical union. So I was interested in the way that things stand right now on two separate stories. NUMSA has agreed to a wage deal at the Gautrain for an increase of 4.2%. Now, inflation's at 3%, so 4.2%, you're not doing too badly. I imagine they'll say there's a little bit of a shortfall from what's happened in the past that needs to be made up. Gautrain have clearly signed it. It is only for a year, I should say. So NUMSA demanded and have got 4.2%. Solidarity is representing the pilots that fly SAFAir, and they're demanding 10%. Who's radical now? He says mischievously.
The Money Show, Tech Thursday.
Well, there must be thousands and thousands of data centers around the world. And you can just imagine, in a way, if you have a data center on your soil, how much money that can bring, but also how many resources that can bring. Now, some countries on our continent are a little worried about being left behind. Nigeria is asking companies like Google, Microsoft, Amazon to kind of get going with whether or not they're going to have data centers in that country. And we have one or two here. Jan Vermeulen's the editor at mybroadband.co.za. Jan, good evening. I mean, data's obviously the new gold. I presume data centers play a big role in the new data rush.
Yeah, indeed, and definitely more than one or two data centers on South African soil. We're actually doing extremely well there. In terms of AI compute, we are actually among the top in the world at the moment. Our industry there, homegrown, really stands back for no one, is second to none. And so far, so good in South Africa. And yeah, I guess if data is the new gold, then data centers, I don't know, might be the new mines.
What's in a data center? I have a vision of an awful lot of servers and a lot of electricity and perhaps water going into it.
Yes, that's pretty accurate. So something that people often forget is the actual infrastructure around the servers that make them work. So data centers are really just halls where you can put your servers or your racks, and then your servers go into the racks. And those halls are supplied with redundant power feeds, with cooling, which involves water, fire suppression, physical security, because your servers are only as safe as the physical security that protects them. If somebody can get physical access to your computer, then it's actually an immense risk. That's probably one of the greater risks to defend against. And so these things, it's not the computing power. The data center providers themselves don't sell the compute power usually. They sell the space. And then you have the other providers who come in and they put the servers down, but they need that all that infrastructure around it, so that if there's a power failure due to load shedding, for example, or if an air conditioner seizes up, that there's redundancies. And people who supply compute power usually don't want that headache. They want that handled for them.
Are there particular places which are better than others? So obviously power, but I'm talking geographically. You don't want to be anyone near an earthquake, although I imagine there are plenty in California anyway. Does temperature matter? Does where it is in the world matter in terms of connections to other places and speeds?
It can, and so that's something that's made South Africa particularly attractive. But geography probably has less to do with it than expertise, and then the remainder of the infrastructure around it. in South Africa's case, we have a lot of undersea cable capacity landing at our shores, which is extremely convenient for them. There's some geographical things that matter, but temperature, ambient temperature, not really. That's something that can be compensated for. But access to relatively affordable energy is one thing, and obviously in South Africa, all kinds of steps have been taken to mitigate against that. And then I know you've alluded to the water already, and although South Africa is a water-scarce country, there's all kinds of tricks that these providers use to make sure that they use water sparingly and that they, don't waste potable water.
Obviously, AI will require a lot more of this, right? Are those data centers very different? And I suppose the one thing that I was interested in is whether there's just there's just sort of more intensity, more demand for power, more demand for water, maybe more demand for space and air conditioning as well.
Yeah, so they're not. I would say manifestly different from your regular servers. The actual, like at a technical level, the actual chips and stuff that go into making the graphics, typically graphics hardware that's now become the mainstay of AI processing. That's just a particular kind of computer, and so you can think of it as the supercomputers of old, or not that old. We still have supercomputers that also go in data centers, and it's really much the same rules there. And you've got some data centers that are better than others. Some they spec to a greater level of redundancy and so on. But for AI, not really. The same principles apply. It's just there you literally just put different server hardware down for the compute load that you're going to use.
Is there a great benefit to having them in your particular country? So I imagine obviously they'll employ certain people, and I presume the company that owns them gets certain revenues. But apart from that, I mean, does it help you if you're in Johannesburg and the data center is in Johannesburg, if you see what I mean, and you're the end user? If you're watching Netflix or Showmax or Apple or whatever, and the thing is stored there, does that help?
Yeah, absolutely. And so from a consumer perspective, that development, the fact that, so Teraco is a major supplier here is a major data center operator here in South Africa, and they established an internet exchange called NAP Africa. And what made this so revolutionary in South Africa is that they pushed for free peering. And I don't want to get bogged down in the technical details of it, but the outcome of this was very, very cheap high-speed broadband. It's part of the reason 100 megabits per second connection in South Africa on fiber went down from, say, 3,000, 4,000 Rand a month to now 1,200 to 1,500 Rand a month. It's really it took an axe to the price of bandwidth. Suddenly, the cost of bandwidth goes to zero, and the only thing the consumer has to pay for almost is the physical infrastructure. It's not entirely zero, but it's very, bandwidth has become extremely cheap as a result. And so, the having the data closer to you improves what we call latency, which is a performance improvement. So the way to think about it is if you type google.com into your browser and you hit enter, the moment between hitting enter and getting a response from the server is your latency. And so the lower down the latency can go, the more responsive your applications can be. So in that sense, it's very beneficial. But like in terms of the economics of it, it's exactly as you laid out. Like in terms of, the sovereignty of South Africa, it's not of huge consequence, except that countries really, really want data to be stored, their own people's data to be stored in their own country. But other than that, where it benefits us is it's a boon in terms of job creation, skills development, skills retention in the country, so we don't bleed as many technical skills overseas, and so on.
Jan Vermeulen, really appreciate the time. Thank you. Editor at mybroadband.co.za. The science, I suppose the economics to an extent, of data centers.
Travel isn't just about destinations. It's about the people you meet, the cultures you immerse yourself in, the stories you carry home. I'm Hlelo Giyose, and on my travel feature, I take you on a journey beyond the guidebook. Each week, I connect with fellow travelers, insiders, and storytellers to bring you the heart of every place, whether it's a hidden gem right here in South Africa or a dream destination abroad. Join me as we travel through conversations, memories, and inspiration. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
The Money Show, Small Business Focus.
We've been talking about the G20 already earlier in the program. I don't know if you know this, but there's also the Startup 20 Township and the Rural Entrepreneurship Task Force. And you can imagine this is quite a good moment to try and insert some of the stories, some of the issues around small businesses into the G20. Bulelani Balabala is a business speaker and township entrepreneur, a member of the task force. Bulelani, good evening. I mean, these are big international conversations. Our finance minister is there. We spoke to the Reserve Bank about it a few moments ago as well. Really important to try and get the sort of small business entrepreneurship conversation and insert it wholly and strongly into these discussions.
No, definitely. I think for me, and I think just good evening to all the listeners, a very important discussion for us to have. And I think I see all the other clusters or forums as you'd have it as part of the G20. But I think in my personal view, this one becomes one of the most important because I think every other week we read headlines of large corporates letting people go. And the next tier of employers really is small business. But also I think when you sort of look across the board, even from manufacturing for consumption, these micro and small, medium-sized businesses are the ones who really are, I think, to a degree, carrying the economy and actually have the appetite and the opportunity to actually drive further development and growth. I mean, you look at percentages. I mean, over 60% of these micro enterprises are driving the economy. But not just that. I mean, the 60% in and itself talks to the livelihoods and the people that live and reside within the township and the rural communities. So this then becomes a part of the economy that we need to shift our mindsets on. It's not the unseen, it's not the untapped, it's not the informal, but it's really us unraveling our mindsets to formalizing ourselves to this particular economy. So I think it's an important conversation that needs to ram its way all the way up to the G20. But I think for me, also not just a conversational piece, actual action-driven solutions behind solving for the immediate individual. Because I think when you think of the ordinary individual and they think of the SU20 and the G20 and all these big terms and acronyms, they think, it's another one of those things that's not for us. So I think this gives us an opportunity, I think, through our initiatives to give it an actual voice and a face with all the other panel members and also my chair for the startup, township and rural economy ecosystem.
To try and, it requires a lot of lobbying to get these things done. And obviously, if you're a corporate, for example, you probably have a lobby, I don't know, I'm sure they have a lobbying budget. Yeah. When you're a small business organization, it's a little different. And yet, it's so important to have that voice being expressed there. Can it be a little difficult to get some attention? I mean, there's a lot on the agenda. Every time I have a G20 conversation, someone brings up the Trump administration. Yeah. But to kind of get heard, it's more than just putting your hand up.
I think what we've done, and I think also what I've done in my own personal capacity is, I think in the past couple of years, I've served as an NDP 2030 ambassador, youth ambassador. I think this appointment was like 5 or 6 years ago, and a number of others. But I think what I've learned now better than I did then is not to actually wait for any action to be given after the appointment. But I think if I see value in having my name thrown in the hat, let's actually start to solve and assist them in solving for solutions. And I think my mindset has sort of shifted. Every single thing that I sort of complain about from a government's perspective, policy and the sort, I've said now to the team, let's try to find and build solutions with the ones who are willing to build solution with us, especially in solving those problems. Is it our job to solve all the problems? I think in a country, in the type of country that we live in, we know a couple of things. With over 25 million people on social grants, the government can't do it alone. So I think in my personal view, if we've got the capacity and have other willing players, we'll then play our part. So we don't have the budgets of the big B20 organizations and the G20 organizations. But I think being given this opportunity for me personally is an opportunity to make as much noise as we potentially can in the corner that we have, so that we then act as an honest and true filter for the voice of small business. Because I think what we've seen over the years is we've seen a number of organizations, on forums, getting the platforms and the status, but only to have them advocate for their chairs and the individuals who were in power. But the people, the constituents that put them there, almost receive nothing. And I think that then becomes a great opportunity for, number one, integrity at play, the right individuals in the right rooms and the right places, but giving voice to the voiceless in an authentic and genuine manner.
So it was interesting. There's a small business owner. She's the CEO of a very small business, sitting in the chair you're in now last night. And I asked her about, there are all of these programs for small businesses. We talk about them often on the Money Show. Some of them come from government. Are they kind of right? And she said, some of them are. You can go back and listen to how she put it. But that's how I understood it. What I'm trying to get to is so many other countries. I mean, India has a similar problem to ours, similar issues. And there's a big argument about informal versus formal at the moment. I don't want to have that argument. But there are certainly lessons that we can learn from each other around red tape. I mean, India has the same problem with red tape, by the way. They call it something else. They call it a license, Raj. Actually, it's a fascinating phrase. But the issues around red tape that everyone could learn from, I would like to think that if there's a proper conversation at a G20 summit where everyone's in the same room and so many people are facing the same problems, the American economy wasn't always the American economy.
Yeah. No, definitely. I mean, I think when I think about that, right, especially the conversation around red tape, around municipal bylaws being laxed for the operational business, I think I always sort of default to an example that I make. I mean, at the height of the lockdown, not necessarily at the height of the lockdown, but at the height of the riots, when you had the riots breaking out, I mean, there was a lot of calls coming in from left and right, talking to supporting these businesses and small businesses that got affected by the looting. And I think in that moment, we then took it upon ourselves to support, to raise our hand and develop a stream and a flow to support these businesses. But obviously, we don't have the funds. We've got access to these individuals, and we had a number of corporates throw some money in the pot for us to then do this. But a couple of things that we got, especially as part of the funding that we got, was a list of, I think what you'd call it, ridiculous or crazy requirements that would ordinarily be fulfilled by a medium-sized business. And then I think what we had to do in that moment was, number one, to demonstrate that, yes, compliance is important. We don't want it to be completely thrown off because it holds everything together. But at the very same time, there are other things that you could then measure for. When we then started to then build up those pieces and other things and other tools to measure for, you now found that you were then acting as a great conduit for the individuals on the other side who are consistently feeling not heard and not given the opportunities to access, and the individuals, I guess, who are actually the funders, walking away with the documents that they need to report back to, whether it's Exco or the auditors. And I think the biggest thing that I always find, I think, is a consistent feature is the fact that there's almost similar language to a degree spoken, but often misheard because of the language that is utilized, and the individuals on the other hand are not actually receiving it, which is why then it's become very important for us to say, for the opportunities that we even facilitate from a procurement level, we will act as surety on behalf of those entrepreneurs that we are facilitating the market access to, so that there is no lax in the delivery, but also we don't rule them off for failure to deliver when they had the willingness because they don't understand the requirements and how to deliver. So compliance then becomes an important thing. And I think my ethos is simple. Build solid, strong township and rural businesses that will compete at a global scale, not weak ones.
Bulelani Balabala, thanks very much indeed. Really appreciate you coming in. A township entrepreneur, of course, and someone who's been a part of all of these task forces. Bulelani, good to see you. Over the years, you've heard me ask wealth manager Warren Ingram the big questions. How do we invest wisely? How do we protect our family's future? All those conversations, that entire library of financial expertise is now available as a podcast. Straightforward advice to help you build your wealth on demand. Just search for Warren Ingram's Personal Finance wherever you get your podcasts.
The Money Show.
Investment School.
Well, you know, of course, that the big issue with investments, with shares, recently has really been, in a way, the negotiating style of the US President Donald Trump. Sometimes it's been quite difficult for the people he's negotiating with to actually understand. And there's a new report out about this, and it looks at two particular examples. The one is Apple. Apple, of course, is a particular company with a particular problem. So it makes products that are designed in the United States, famously in California. They are often manufactured in China or India by a company called Foxconn, which is Taiwanese owned. what we're getting to is how Apple finds itself in the fire of Trump's tariffs. At the same time, as you know very, very well, I think many South Africans have been astounded, surprised, caught off guard by some of the demands and comments made about our economy and our country by Trump and members of his administration. Well, a couple of interesting theories as to understand all of this. And part of this is a new report that's been put out by First Avenue Investment Management. Their Chief Investment Officer and Principal is Hlelo Giyose. He joins us now. And Gary Booysen is on the line too. He's the director at Rand Swiss. Gentlemen, good evening. Hlelo, if I may start with you. In your report, you use a particular word, and the phrase is the Lula-Palooza effect. What is a Lula-Palooza effect, and how on earth does that relate to Trump?
Good evening, Stephen. Thank you for having me. So Lollapalooza effect is a psychological term, or it's a term that refers to the psychological befuddlement that leads to misjudgment on something that is actually logical, but appears to be completely out of the ordinary. So it's an extraordinary claim that someone makes. It's an extraordinary occurrence. It's what in statistics they call a Six Sigma event that is completely incredulous, but is actually happening in reality. You cannot believe that Donald Trump says that South Africa has a law that is victimizing in a genocidal proportion white people, right? It's completely unbelievable. It is as unbelievable as if I was to tell you that one team won the World Cup rugby 4 times in a row. That is unbelievable. Well, if I tell you, Lionel Messi and Cristiano Ronaldo won the FIFA World Player of the Year for 13 years straight between them. How does that happen, right? So Trump uses this technique to pitch something that is completely unbelievable to you as a starting point, to the point that when you do get to compromise, you are no longer looking at a 50-50, at a win-win situation. You give up everything. You give up everything because you realize that the only way you are ever going to stay halfway in the game is if you actually cave in on all his demands. He's done that in business, and he's a businessman. So this is out of the norms of politics. This is what he's done in business. It's worked to great effect, and he's doing it in politics.
So that means then that you almost don't understand what's going on, so you take your eye off the ball. Would that be another way of sort of saying it, of putting it?
You are thrown in a different direction. You're completely thrown in, you're quote unquote thrown for a loop, right? So you start talking to him about the genocidal claims, and you want to address that. You want to prove to him that that is not the case, right? Well, you're actually wasting time because that's not his real interest. His real interest is to talk to you about your position in BRICS and your position, your internal laws that, as far as he's concerned, are breaching the World Trade Order, right? And you get to think, okay, he's going to stop accusing me of genocide if I give up on BRICS, if I give up on BE, if I give up on everything that he subsequently says, do this, do that, do that. Then I won't accuse you of genocide anymore. Hence, South Africa made a mistake of thinking, well, let's give Starlink. And he didn't want Starlink. That's not what he wants, right? There are poultry exports from the United States coming into South Africa that attract a 65% duty, right? Then there is an internal paywall called BE, right? And then there are a whole host of what the UN CAD says are non-tariff measures that really get in the way of capital moving freely, goods moving freely, and people moving freely. So if you're an actor, an American actor, you wanted to come here and act here, you'd have to get all sorts of clearances. And if you wanted to have a program or a show at some theater, you have to see what kind of local production, local content, and so on and so forth. That's what Netflix has to deal with, local production and local content, for instance. But Sarafina can go to the United States and put on a show on Broadway. No one asks for local content. No one asks for local quotas. Nothing, right? And he says, take that out because I don't put that on you in the United States. Don't put it on people that Americans who come here or anybody else who comes here. Take all of that out.
Gary Booysen, do you agree with this? Do you think that Hlelo was onto something here with the Lollapalooza effect, that this was what Trump was doing all along?
Well, I think that there's no question that Trump has the ability to move the Overton window like no one else. So you just look at it in the context of the reciprocal tariffs that were announced. I think pre the initial announcement, if anyone had said that we'd be grateful for a 10% tariff, you would have called them crazy. Yet when you come in with just absolutely these obscenely insane requirements, suddenly 10% doesn't look so bad, and it does feel a little bit like out of the deal. And I think a lot of the negotiations, a lot of them, I do agree, like they have been to an extent pretext as well. I think maybe I've got a slightly different reading on what makes the White House policy make sense. But no question that this, kind of like these extreme claims are definitely part of the negotiating style of Trump. 100% agree with that. And I think, the idea that BRICS is really core to, the underlying issue rather than something like Starlink, absolutely agree as well. Because, from our reading of it, if you look at the US has a real fear that it'll lose its dominance to the likes of China. And if you look 10 years out, it's almost a guaranteed thing. Now, one of the challenges that the US is facing is that it is one of the most powerful economies in the world currently. But as more and more economies team up, they lose their overall power. So this is a direct attack on multilateralism. So the likes of the World Trade Organization, anything, an organization like BRICS, where you suddenly put in Brazil, Russia, China, India, and South Africa, and many other countries that have now joined into a multilateral framework, that's incredibly threatening to the US. And while Trump might focus on genocide claims, or in all different economies, there's different, I suppose, of these radical claims. It seems quite clear that the idea is to break up these multilateral organizations, because it's you can kind of almost look at it in a bar. The US is the big bruiser in the corner, and they can take anyone one-on-one. But as soon as people start kind of ganging up on the US, they're going to fail. And I think that is really where the US foreign policy is being driven. I think that's the first step. The second step is that the US has been very pro reducing tariff barriers. I think anyone who studied economics, over the last probably 30 years, has almost had it drummed into them. Lower tariff barriers are good for everyone. It'll increase global productivity. The problem is it also heavily favors the country that has the higher manufacturing base. And when the US was very pro free markets and open trade and dropping tariff barriers, this was, you've got to put it in context of the US history. So following World War II, there was a huge drop off in manufacturing in the US as the economy converted from kind of wartime production to more traditional production, but it immediately recovered. And since then, they've been losing their share of global manufacturing, as a part of the whole. And what that means is their, lower tariff barriers were less and less beneficial to the US. Now what happens is, with China being the manufacturing base of the world, lower tariff barriers benefits China more than the US. And if they are seeing this as a head-to-head competition between China for essentially global supremacy, what happens then is you need to increase tariff barriers, because that is actually in the best interest of the US currently. And I think that's our read on why Trump is so pro these tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers, that is, because it actually does. Leveling the playing field for the US is a massive advantage to the US over time, because they are no longer that manufacturing base of the world.
So, Hlelo, if you're President Ramaphosa and you're in the Oval Office and you're confronted with this sort of Lollapalooza kind of technique, how do you respond? It's not clear immediately. And I mean, there was a lot of speculation and discussion about what Trump really wants, right? But how do you respond? I mean, you can try and be sober, but that doesn't always work.
Well, I think that you respond by meeting him where he is. And he is not completely irrational or illogical. He's not completely unfair. When you think about it, the United States is underwriting prosperity for the rest of the world. If I tell you, right, if I say to you, hey, you can have a 37 billion rand trade surplus with me, right? Meaning that you can sell me $37 billion more goods or rands more than I can sell to you. But then you turn around and you have a 238 billion rand deficit, trade deficit with BRICS countries. And all the BRICS countries have a surplus with me and they have a deficit with China. Guess what? You are actually, as the United States, underwriting prosperity in South Africa, you're underwriting it in China, you're underwriting it in Russia, you're underwriting it in India, you're underwriting it in 90 countries. I think it's 90 countries out of 180 countries that America has a trade deficit with. And the deficits it has are much larger than the surpluses it has. So when Trump looks at that and says, but how come when the Houthis attack ships in the Red Sea, no one goes there to try to unblock those waterways? I have to go there, spend trillions of dollars or billions of dollars, and quell the fuss over this. I'm also underwriting global trade. So I actually need to have the kind of currency and the kind of funding that allows me to be, quote unquote, the world's police and the world's underwriter of prosperity. So he's not wrong because China does nothing. China does not take responsibility for anything in the world, even to its best friend, Iran, who got attacked recently. China did absolutely nothing. So Donald Trump is not wrong. So you have to meet him where he is and say, okay, I need to switch my deficit to China to you. I will sell to you, but I'm going to start not buying Huawei network equipment for MTN and so on. I'm going to buy American telecommunications equipment. I'm going to buy Boeing planes. I'm going to buy American military equipment. I'm going to switch. And if you do that, that's obviously the end of BRICS. That's obviously the end of BRICS. But at the same time, you have to really consider, if you don't do that, China is not trying to build jobs in South Africa, as you can see. They want to sell you cars they make. They're actually polluting the world with excess capacity, right? So they're killing you whilst you're their trading partner, whilst you're their BRICS partner. So you really have to meet him where he is and take your own best interests at heart when you do that.
We're speaking to Hlelo Giyose and Gary Booysen on Investment School this evening, all about matters Trump and the impact on companies. In a moment, the impact on Apple. Over the years, you've heard me ask wealth manager Warren Ingram the big questions. How do we invest wisely? How do we protect our family's future? All those conversations, that entire library of financial expertise is now available as a podcast. Straightforward advice to help you build your wealth on demand. Just search for Warren Ingram's Personal Finance wherever you get your podcasts.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Bank, proud sponsor of the African Blockchain Report 2024.
The Money Show.
Investment School.
Speaking to Hlelo Giyose and Gary Booysen tonight about how you, I suppose, negotiate against Trump, but the impact of Trump as well. There's a new report out from First Avenue Investment Management. Hlelo is their chief investment officer about all of this. Gary Booysen's director at Rand Swiss. Gentlemen, we've got just a couple of moments left, and I do need to start with Gary here. Gary, Apple, the company, is kind of uniquely exposed to the new sort of trade world. Plenty of other companies have global supply chains. Why is Apple so uniquely exposed? Gary Booysen, are you still with us?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons for its unique exposure. So first of all, I'm with you. Can you not hear me?
All right, we seem to be losing you there. We're going to just try and fix that line. In the meantime, Hlelo, you write about Apple in your report. I mean, clearly you are taking quite a bearish view. You think that something has fundamentally changed around Apple, and it may never actually be the same again after this.
Well, it cannot be the same again because Apple is China, and China is Apple. Apple based its entire business model on letting China provide it with a conveyor belt of skilled engineers. Do you know that the total workforce of Apple, if you consider all the employees worldwide, 50% are Asian, and Asian means Indian plus Chinese, right? It's recruiting very competent but very affordable engineers that the government of China has put out to manufacture beautiful product that's been designed in the United States to work to perfection. Apple is the one company whose products have zero defect, right? And it's inextricably linked to manufacturing and controlling the supply chain in China, whether it's equipment, whether it's the skills there, and it sends engineers from the United States to China to work with Chinese engineers. And Chinese engineers have taken this technology and made Huawei, and they've made other products, which are now, by the way, number one selling smartphones in the world, right? So Apple has invested about $550 billion. You know, that is about $450 billion more in today's money than what America put into the Marshall Plan in 1945. Apple has been about as consequential to China as America was to Europe.
It's a big comment to make. Is this the end of Apple then, as we've come to know it, this kind of juggernaut that just pushes out products and pushes out money in a way that really we hadn't seen before now?
I don't think it's the end of Apple, but it's certainly the beginning of the diversification of Apple's supply chain. It can no longer be as dependent on China as it used to be. And by the way, Apple has fallen behind in artificial intelligence, so it does not have the bargaining chip to transfer to China anymore, right? So it's the end of Apple's supply chain being concentrated in Apple's supply chain being concentrated in China. They're shifting to Vietnam, they're shifting to Taiwan, they're shifting to India. And guess what China is doing? China is pulling back engineers that Apple's contracting manufacturer had sent to India to go and help India to come up. It's pulling them back because China does not want to share technology. So Apple is going to fall behind by a few generations, I believe.
Gary, we've got just 2 minutes left. Do you agree with that? Apple is suddenly in a position where the investment case is completely different to where it was just a year ago.
There's no question about that. So I didn't hear a lot of that, unfortunately, due to technical issues. So I don't know whether I agree or not. But I can tell you, Apple's selling 60 million phones annually in the US, and 80% of those are manufactured in China. So of course, any tariff barriers that are put in place are going to have a significant impact. At the same time, there's the technical challenges around moving as well. So they're talking about moving, a large part of their production base to India. But when you have, such erratic tariff policies, and we've heard that, India and the US are very close to an agreement around what the final, I suppose, the picture is going to look like. But when you have that kind of uncertainty, you move factories to India to supply into the US, and at a stroke of a pen, you can change all of that. I mean, that's incredibly risky for a company. And the fact is, there's a little clip that does around on social media with Tim Cook chatting about tooling engineers, and I'm sure many of the listeners have seen it. But the simple fact is that these are, manufacturing at this level and complexity and at the specification that Apple requires is incredibly specialist, incredibly
incredibly technical work, and it's not something that you can lift up in one country and drop in the other, in any short space of time. It takes years to build these kinds of production facilities. It takes years to train and upskill the types of engineers that you need to produce this kind of product. And I think that's one of probably the most alarming reactions that we're going to see, and I think global markets are discounting it to a large extent, is that with these broad sweeping changes, against a very, very complex system, the outcome can be very unpredictable.
Gary Booysen, thank you so much. Gary Booysen is director at Rand Swiss. Sorry about the technical problems. Hlelo Giyose is the chief investment officer and principal at First Avenue Investment Management. And, of course, some very interesting views and thoughts about the sort of deliberate strategy, it seems, by the Trump administration in terms of their negotiations with us.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Bank, proud sponsor of the African Blockchain Report 2024.
With strong retail figures out of the US, a strong result from PepsiCo as well. That's pushing markets up there tonight. The Dow Jones up nearly 0.5%. The Nasdaq up nearly 0.8%. The S&P 500 up nearly 0.5% as well so far. A lot more trading, of course, still to come. We'll be back with you tomorrow for the Friday edition of The Money Show. Good evening. It's 8 o'clock.